Good morning. This is Krista McAuliffe, live from the Challenger, and I'm going to be taking you through a field trip.
The morning was calm. The sky looked perfect. And for a brief moment, it felt like nothing could go wrong. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger rose into the air, carrying 7 astronauts who believed they were flying toward glory. But just 73 seconds later, the shuttle exploded before millions of eyes. It was one of the most shocking moments ever broadcast live. But the real story didn't end in that cloud of smoke. Because when the shuttle broke apart, the crew didn't die right away. So, what happened in those final minutes? And what did NASA really find when they searched the ocean floor? Let's go back to where it all began. The launch day. From the very beginning, things didn't look right. The morning of January 28, 1986, was unusually cold in Florida. Ice had formed on the launch pad overnight. Engineers warned that the freezing temperatures could affect the shuttle's hardware, especially the rubber O-rings that sealed the joints of the solid rocket boosters. Those rings were never designed to function in such low temperatures. Despite multiple warnings, NASA decided to proceed with the launch after several previous delays. At 11:38 a.m., the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Cape Canaveral. On board were 7 astronauts: Francis R. Scobie, Michael J. Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian teacher chosen to fly in space. Across the United States, millions of people, including students in classrooms, watched the launch live. In the first minute, everything appeared normal. The boosters fired as planned, and the shuttle climbed steadily through a clear sky. Mission Control reported normal readings. For NASA, this was supposed to be a moment of pride after multiple postponements. From the outside, things looked perfect. But deep inside the right solid rocket booster, a small flaw was growing. The cold had hardened the O-ring, preventing it from sealing a joint completely. A thin jet of flame began leaking from the gap. Within seconds, the fire burned through the lower section of the booster and reached the external fuel tank, which contained over 2 million liters of liquid hydrogen and oxygen. At 73 seconds after liftoff, the tank failed under extreme pressure. It ruptured violently, releasing the fuel in an explosive cloud. The Challenger broke apart in the sky, scattering debris across the Atlantic Ocean. From the ground, it appeared as a bright flash, followed by 2 trails of white smoke. People watching were silent, unsure of what had happened. Mission Control quickly confirmed what many feared. The vehicle had exploded. Every major news network replayed the footage again and again. The shock spread worldwide. It was the first time a space mission had ended like this, in full view of the public. Initially, everyone assumed the crew had died instantly, but later investigations revealed something different. The explosion. The explosion wasn't one sudden blast. It was a chain of failures that happened in seconds. A few seconds after launch, the fire escaping from the right booster burned through the fuel tank. The liquid hydrogen and oxygen inside mixed and ignited, tearing the shuttle apart. To viewers on the ground, it looked like a single massive explosion. But technically, it was the orbiter breaking apart under stress and heat. The shuttle was traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The sudden loss of structure caused it to disintegrate in mid-air. Fragments of the boosters, fuel tank, and main cabin scattered across the sky. Engineers later described it as a rapid structural breakup rather than a true detonation. The force separated the crew cabin from the rest of the orbiter. It stayed mostly intact as it continued rising to a height of around 65,000 feet before beginning its fall. This small detail changed everything about how investigators understood the disaster. Inside that cabin were 7 astronauts, still strapped to their seats. At least 3 of them had activated their emergency air packs, which could only have been done by hand. The switch on one pack was located behind the pilot's seat, meaning another crew member had to reach over and turn it on. This showed that some of them were conscious after the breakup. No voice transmissions were recorded from the cabin after the explosion. It is believed that communication systems failed instantly. Investigators later suggested that the crew may have lost cabin pressure, causing them to lose consciousness within seconds. But there was no evidence of an immediate fatal event. The cabin then began to fall back toward the ocean. The descent lasted nearly 3 minutes. It ended when the compartment struck the Atlantic at more than 200 miles per hour, a force far beyond human survival. Even so, the question remained: how did NASA find the cabin in the vast ocean, and what did they discover inside? To answer that, the search had to move from the sky to the sea. Because the shuttle did not completely explode, the main crew cabin had separated and was still intact. And what happened inside during those final moments would raise questions no one was prepared to face. Inside the falling cabin, when the Challenger broke apart, most of its structure disintegrated in midair. But the crew cabin did not. It separated from the main body and remained mostly intact. Made of reinforced aluminum, it was strong enough to survive the initial breakup. Engineers later calculated that the cabin continued to rise after the explosion, reaching an altitude of about 65,000 feet before beginning its fall. From that point, it followed a long, curved path toward the Atlantic Ocean. The entire descent lasted almost 3 minutes. Inside, the 7 astronauts were still strapped to their seats. Evidence recovered later showed that several had tried to respond. 3 personal air packs had been switched on. The activation could only have been done manually, indicating that at least some of the crew were still conscious after the breakup. One of the clearest indications was that pilot Michael J. Smith's air pack had been turned on, even though its switch was located behind his seat. This meant that another crew member had reached over to activate it for him. Investigators also found cockpit switches moved from their original positions, likely in an attempt to restore power or control. However, there were no systems that could have saved them. The shuttle had no parachutes or emergency ejection methods that worked at such altitude and speed. Communication had already been lost, and the cabin had no way to stabilize itself during the fall. Experts later suggested 2 possibilities. Some believed that the cabin depressurized quickly, causing unconsciousness within seconds. Others thought a partial pressure might have remained for a short time, keeping them conscious for part of the descent. The exact sequence could not be determined. When the cabin struck the ocean at a speed of over 200 miles per hour, the impact produced a force more than 200 times the pull of gravity. The structure shattered instantly. No human could survive such a collision. The wreckage then sank rapidly, descending more than 100 feet below the surface. Debris spread across a wide area of the seafloor. For days, recovery teams searched the ocean surface, but only scattered fragments appeared. The main cabin had disappeared beneath the waves. No one yet knew where it had landed or what condition it was in. Finding it would become one of the most difficult recovery missions NASA had ever faced. The search beneath the sea. After the Challenger disaster, NASA and the U.S. Navy began a massive search operation off the coast of Florida. The goal was to locate the crew cabin and other major sections of the shuttle that had fallen into the Atlantic. The first stage focused on floating debris. Coast Guard and Navy vessels collected pieces of insulation, panels, and booster fragments. But larger parts, including the cabin, were believed to have sunk. Within a week, the mission shifted to a deep-water recovery. Using sonar systems, underwater cameras, and divers, teams scanned the sea floor across an area of nearly 500 square nautical miles. The wreckage field was spread over uneven terrain, making it difficult to identify what belonged to the shuttle. Weather and strong ocean currents often interrupted the work. Dozens of ships and submarines participated. Every discovery was carefully documented and brought to the surface for examination. Each fragment helped narrow down the search area for the cabin. On March 7, 1986, more than a month after the explosion, divers from the USS Preserver located large sections of the Challenger's crew compartment. It was lying about 100 to 200 feet below the surface. Inside were the remains of the astronauts. The recovery operation was immediately classified as highly sensitive. NASA emphasized dignity and confidentiality. Only a limited number of officials and military divers were allowed to participate in handling the cabin and remains. No photographs or detailed information were released. Over the next several weeks, divers worked carefully to retrieve every identifiable part. Sections of the cabin were lifted using cranes and transported to a secure facility for analysis. The process continued until April 1986, when NASA confirmed that all 7 astronauts had been recovered. The mission was one of the most complex underwater recoveries ever carried out by the United States. It ended quietly, without public ceremony, in respect for the crew and their families. Once the remains were safely returned to land, a new stage of work began, identifying each astronaut and determining what could be learned from the evidence. The identification of crew. After the Challenger crew cabin was recovered, the remains were carefully transferred to Patrick Air Force Base near Cape Canaveral. From there, they were sent to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology for examination. The task was to identify each astronaut and, to the extent possible, determine the circumstances of death. It was a slow and difficult process. The remains had been underwater for weeks and were severely damaged by the force of the impact. The condition of the wreckage made standard identification methods impossible. Instead, pathologists relied on dental records, fragments of flight suits, and small identifiable items to match individuals. NASA and the military maintained complete secrecy. Families were informed privately, and only a small number of people were permitted to view the evidence. No photographs or detailed descriptions were released to the public. Officials emphasized that the purpose of the investigation was not to expose the physical condition of the remains, but to ensure that every crew member was treated with respect. The examinations confirmed what many already suspected. The impact of the ocean had caused fatal injuries beyond survivability. It was not possible to determine whether the astronauts had died before or during the fall. The damage from the water impact was so severe that it obscured any evidence of oxygen loss or decompression. Medical experts concluded that even if some of the crew had survived the initial breakup, they could not have lived through the impact. The official reports described the causes of death simply as multiple traumatic injuries, without further detail. This careful language was intentional. NASA faced an ethical decision about how much information should be shared. At the time, public curiosity was high, and rumors were spreading through news outlets. But NASA chose to keep the findings private out of respect for the families. Officials stated clearly that releasing graphic information would serve no scientific or public purpose. There was also a jurisdiction dispute. The local medical examiner in Brevard County argued that the remains should legally fall under county authority for autopsy and death certificates. NASA disagreed, explaining that the case involved federal personnel who had died during a government mission. After discussions, the Department of Defense retained full control of the process. Death certificates were later issued under NASA's supervision. Once identification was complete, the remains were released to the astronauts' families for burial. Each was accompanied by a military escort and handled with full honors. The process took several weeks, ending in late April 1986. But the story didn't end there. What followed wasn't just a burial, it was a national moment of grief and unity. The final farewell of the Challenger crew would reveal how deeply this tragedy had touched the country. The farewell. By late April 1986, NASA had completed the identification of all 7 Challenger astronauts. The focus then turned from investigation to remembrance. The nation that had watched the disaster unfold was now preparing to honor its fallen crew. Each astronaut's remains were handled with military care. Caskets draped in the American flag were placed aboard a transport aircraft at Kennedy Space Center. From there, they were flown to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, accompanied by honor guards and fellow astronauts. The process was private and dignified. No media were allowed to record the transfer. NASA and the families arranged individual services according to personal wishes. Commander Francis R. Scobie and pilot Michael J. Smith were both laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, in graves that remain places of quiet reflection. Ellison Onizuka was buried in Honolulu at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, while Ronald McNair was laid to rest in his hometown of Lake City, South Carolina. Judith Resnick's remains were cremated, and her ashes were scattered at sea. Krista McAuliffe, the schoolteacher whose participation had inspired millions, was buried in her hometown of Concord, New Hampshire. Gregory Jarvis was also cremated, with his ashes released into the Pacific Ocean. Not all of the remains could be clearly separated. Some fragments were too small or too damaged to identify individually. To ensure every member of the crew was honored, NASA organized a collective burial at Arlington National Cemetery. The commingled remains were placed together in a single grave, Section 46, Grave 1129, beneath a granite memorial engraved with the crew's names. The site includes the poem High Flight, often recited in aviation memorials, symbolizing the courage and sacrifice of those who reach beyond the sky. Funeral ceremonies were solemn and brief. NASA Administrator William Graham and President Ronald Reagan both issued statements praising the bravery of the crew. Reagan had addressed the nation on the night of the disaster, saying the astronauts had slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. In the weeks that followed, that line became a symbol of national mourning. The space program was suspended, while the Rogers Commission continued to investigate the technical causes of the accident. But the focus during this period was human, giving closure to the families and paying public respect to those who had died in service to exploration. Flags across the country were lowered to half-mast. Schools held assemblies in memory of Krista McAuliffe. At Kennedy Space Center, thousands of employees attended a private memorial where flowers were released into the Atlantic, near the area where the shuttle had fallen. For many, that seemed like the end. But what followed in the months and years after would change how the world remembered the Challenger and how NASA would move forward forever. The legacy. The Challenger disaster changed the course of American space exploration. It exposed serious flaws in decision-making, engineering, and safety procedures at NASA. But it also left behind a legacy of reform, education, and remembrance. After the funerals, the Rogers Commission completed its official investigation. The report concluded that the accident had been caused by the failure of the O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. The cold weather had prevented the seal from functioning properly, allowing hot gases to escape and destroy the external fuel tank. The commission also found that engineers had raised concerns before launch, but those warnings were not taken seriously by management. As a result, NASA faced widespread criticism. The Space Shuttle program was suspended for nearly 3 years. During that time, the agency redesigned the rocket boosters, improved safety protocols, and changed its communication systems so that engineers could report potential risks directly. These changes shaped the future of every mission that followed. Beyond the technical lessons, the Challenger crew became a symbol of courage and learning. Schools, libraries, and public buildings were named in their honor. The Challenger Center for Space Science Education was created by the astronauts' families to continue their mission of inspiring students to explore science and space. Since its founding, it has reached millions of young people around the world. At Kennedy Space Center, the Space Mirror Memorial was later built to honor all astronauts who lost their lives during missions. Carved from black granite, it reflects the sky and bears the names of the Challenger crew alongside others who died in service. At Arlington National Cemetery, the Challenger Memorial remains a quiet place of remembrance where visitors still leave flowers and small flags. The disaster also changed how the public viewed space exploration. It reminded the world that progress in science often comes with risk. The astronauts' deaths were not in vain. Their mission led to safer designs, stricter reviews, and a stronger culture of accountability within NASA. Today, the names of Scobie, Smith, McAuliffe, Resnick, Onizuka, McNair, and Jarvis remain synonymous with bravery. Their story continues to be taught as a lesson in responsibility, resilience, and dedication. Though the Challenger never reached orbit, its crew achieved something larger. They reminded humanity of the cost of discovery and the value of learning from tragedy. Their journey ended in the sky, but their legacy continues to guide every mission that follows. The Challenger crew showed the world what courage looks like. Their mission ended, but their spirit still inspires us to dream bigger and reach higher. So what do you think about the Challenger mission? Was it a failure? Or was it a powerful reminder of humanity's relentless pursuit of progress, even in the face of adversity? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked this video, ensure you give it a thumbs up. Also, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, because we will be uploading more crazy stories like this one in the coming weeks. Until then, see ya.